That story. Go ahead.
During the winter vacation in school, we would go into the woods, and her Pickard, Morris Dunn, Johnny Shellnut, and I would go into the woods, and we would cut, we would probably cut 10, 15 cord of wood. And we would take a team of horses from the farm, and we didn't have a tractor in those days. We did everything with a team of horses. And we would take a team of horses into the woods. And we would work in the woods all day long. And we would bring feed for the horses and work the horses. And then in the afternoon, we would have a truck with us so that Herb Pickard and Johnny Shellnut could go back and start the milking. And they would leave the woodlot probably 1:30, 2 o'clock. And they would head back to the farm to start the afternoon milking. Morris Dunn and I would stay in the woods, and we would clean up the area, and then we would take the horses back, and we would take the horses back to the farm. And we had a sled with us, and we would bring the logs from the woodlot down to the edge of the road on Dale Street, and then put it in the truck and take it to the farm. And this was a huge 2-horse team sled, and it was beautiful because you take the team, hitch the team to the sled, and take them to the farm. Well, during the week when they weren't busy, we'd leave the sled right in the woods, and we just take the team back to the barn and put them in their stalls, and usually Morris would walk. I'd climb on the back of one of the horses and ride them all the way back to the farm, and then we would take care of all of the inside chores. Once we got back to the barn, we would get all the animals fed, get all the barn cleaned up, get the horses fed, put away for the night, and it was just a wonderful time. And all of the wood that we cut in the woodlot was cut into 4.5-foot lengths, and so it could be handled onto the sled and onto the trucks, and then it would be brought back to the farm. And we had what was known at that time as a cordwood saw. It was a huge circular saw, and it ran, usually most farmers had a tractor that they would run it off. Where Kittredge didn't have a tractor, we had an old vehicle. It was an old, we call it the jalopy. It was about a 28 or a 30 whatever year, and we would jack it up, and we would take a leather belt, and we would put a pulley on the outside of the wheel, and we'd put a leather belt on that, and we'd hitch it up to the cordwood saw, and we would just cut cordwood all day long. The men, Herb and Morris, didn't let Johnny and I near the cordwood saw, because that was, one man was pushing the cord into the saw to be hard, the other man was catching it, and he would throw it into the pile. And at that point in time, all Johnny and I did was stand next to whoever was catching it off the saw and make sure it was all went into the pile to keep the area clear so nobody got hurt by the saw, because the saw was a pretty dangerous area.
And there was probably no guard on the saw, just a giant 5 or 6 foot blade.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It was
scary.
It was wonderful. And John Farnham, out on Farnham Street, there was a mill out in back of that. There's a mill still down here, but they don't use the mill anymore because it's too dangerous, really. But
you're saying like a sawmill?
Yeah.
Because I think Blake Adams and I talked about that.
Yeah.
I think I was out there with
Blake had a sawmill on Boxford Street.
Oh, that's a different one.
Yeah, Blake had his own sawmill, and Blake Blake had an insurance company come out to his property and do an assessment for him one time. And the insurance man said to Blake, he said, well, have you got anything else that you want to show me? And Blake said, well, you want to look at my sawmill? And the fellow looked at him and he said, your what? And he said, my sawmill. And he said, where's your sawmill? He said, well, it's down on Boxford Street. So we took his insurance agent down to look at the sawmill. And the insurance man said to Blake, he said, well, you have one of two choices. You can either drop your insurance and get rid of that mill. Because he said, we are not going to insure that mill. So that's when Blake had to stop using his sawmill. And the insurance company, the liability on those sawmills was huge because they were so dangerous. And in those days, there was a great many things that were dangerous. I mean, there really were, because there was no thought of guards and protection, and you just had to be awfully careful around that machinery, because there was spinning wheels and there were pulleys and belts and everything. And it's one of the things that one of the pictures that I have of my father when he was working in a mill and setting up cards, and all of the cards at that time were run by belts, and all these belts had exposed pulleys on them, and if you got caught in one of those pulleys, you could get seriously injured or killed. That's the one thing about Davis and Ferber. Anybody that got hurt or injured in Davis and Ferber had a job with that company for life. Nobody ever got laid off.
Freddie, is that the fellow's name? There was a man with one arm when I worked at the mill behind Davis and Ferber, the Stevens mill that was back there. And he had one arm, and then later on he was driving a forklift at Davis and Ferber in the 70s. And I think he lost his arm to a belt.
Yeah. And there was a man by the name of Girardi, Mr. Girardi. He had a hook on his
one hand,
and Mr. Girardi worked on the. He was such a wonderful man. He was a great, big, powerful man, and he had got hurt in the mill, and he lost one of his hands, and he had a job on the yard gang. I believe he worked with the yard gang for years. And there were a lot of people that I guess in today's world you would call mentally challenged. There was one man named Edgar Dunbar, and then there were several other men in the mill that in today's world would have a very difficult time. They would probably be on public welfare. But Mr. Rockwell always made sure that they had a job at Davis and Ferber, and they were never laid off. Men that got black lung disease and silicosis working in the foundry and were able to come back to work, they were given jobs in the foundry, in tool cribs and different places where they didn't have to work strenuously to impact their health anymore, and they were there for the duration of their life. And I told your sister a story about, and it was told to me by the women that worked in the office, so I'm sure it's true. The railroad came into what we call the yard, which was at the bottom of Elm Street, which was where Davis and Ferber was, on Elm Street, not High Street. It was on Elm Street.
Yeah.
and the railroad cars would come up to the loading platform, and these hobos, or whatever they call at the time, they were called hobos, and they would get out of the boxcars and they would walk up the hill to the office. And they would walk in and walk to the counter, and either every clerk or Lily Polonowski or whoever whoever was there at the time would say, "Can we help you?" And they'd say, "We'd like to see Mr. Rockwell." And Mr. Rockwell never sent the people away. He always came out of his office and spent a few minutes talking to these people. And the girls would tell me he always slipped them a few dollars. And then they would go out and of course they'd probably go to the nearest package store, or Mr. Rockwell probably hoped that they'd get out and get a decent meal. But he never turned them away.
Yeah.
He never said, "Don't come in anymore," or don't bother me with these people. He always came out of his office, which was right on the other side of the building, from where the counter was. And he always came out and addressed these men and gave them a few dollars, and they'd go on their way. But he never turned people away, and he never turned people that got hurt in the mill away. They always had a permanent job in Davis and Fair for the rest of their lives.
Oh, that's so old school and so beautiful.
Yeah. And people don't understand too, the firemen in Davis and Fair. For many of the years, in fact most of the years, I went into the mill, I went into Davis and Ferber in late 1950, and I worked there through 50 and into 1951 before I went in the military. And at that time, we had a call fire department. And there were men in Davis and Ferber that worked on the fire department. And at different places in the mill, they had what we call clappers, that went, every time the fire horn went off, these clappers would sound in these different departments. And the men that were called firemen would immediately run out and get on the fire truck. And it was absolutely hilarious to see it, because where I was working at that time, I was working the tin shop. And there were two men, Ed Koenig and Cal Snell, and they were both deputy fire chiefs. And the minute the first clapper went off, whoever was closest to that clapper, and usually it would be Eddie Koenig, because he was the cylinder man. He made the cylinders, and that's where his station was. And Eddie would holler out to Cal, "Cal, fire!" And wherever Cal was, if he was out in the back room, the men all the way down would call him and make sure that he got
relay.
And they would run up. They'd throw on the jacket, and they'd run out the door of the mill, jump on the fire truck, go to the fire, put the fire out, and they never lost a minute's pay with Davis and Ferber. They were never docked. It was just part of being on the fire department. And when you came to work in Davis and Ferber, as I did in 1950, late 1950, they would ask you, "Do you want to join the fire department?" And if you said yeah, they had a Davis and Ferber fire department. They had hoses, and Davis and Ferber was set up so that if there was ever a fire in the plant, they had their own people that could initiate starting to fight that fire before the town fire department came in. And immediately, if there was a notice of a fire anywhere on the property, you would immediately call the engineer in the power plant, and he would cut in the hydrants. Davis and Ferber had their own fire hydrants.
Oh, and he would power them up.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
And I have pictures, old pictures of the firemen practicing on Elm Street, spraying the building with water, and that water was all pumped out of the pond and back of the company.
Yeah, yeah.
And people don't realize how self-sufficient these people were in the day. There were night watchmen all the time at Davis and Ferber, and they weren't there for security. They were there for fires. That's what they were. That was the big. The big worry was that there would be a fire somewhere, and it would get unattended, and so the night watchman had to make their round every hour and go through the entire plant and check the entire plant, because there's a lot of places in there. The foundry, the scratch rooms, the different departments in town where there were, the forge shop actually had forges. There was 3 or 4 forges that were running all day long in the forge shop. And those forges would have to be put out in the afternoon before, at around 3:30, 4 o'clock, the forge shop would start gearing down and start putting out the forges. And they had to make sure all those forges were out, because these forges were coal-fired to heat up the metal that they were hardening. And Johnny Shellnut's grandfather, old Mr. Shellnut, was in charge of the hardening department. And in his hardening department, they had to take the metals that were to be hardened and they had to heat them. And then they had to treat them through different oil baths and different solutions to make this metal hard, so that it could then be machined and it wouldn't wear out very fast. And so not many people realize, and I told a woman the other day, Davis and Ferber made all their own nuts and bolts. And as a kid, I would try to work on my bicycle when my father was away setting up machinery. And when he'd come home, I'd say, Dad, why can't I tighten my bike? And he said, because you're using the wrong wrenches, Dave. And I said, what are you talking about? It was Davis and Ferber has their own wrenches.
Proprietary wrenches.
They're not
So that you
metric.
couldn't use anybody else. You had to buy. Yeah, I've got a set of them.
Yeah, they were Davis and Ferber. They were not metric, they were not standard, they were Davis and Ferber.
And they had a number like 72, 75.
Yeah.
I don't know what it meant.
Yeah, when my father went to a company and set up a machine, he would leave a set of wrenches so that they could, if there was something minor, they could call them and tell them, well, take one of the wrenches and tighten this down. But they had their own wrenches and everything. And I don't know what happened to all my Davis and Ferber wrenches, and I feel badly that I don't have, but somewhere there probably is the Davis and Ferber. There's some in the Historical Society. And people have no idea that this was the way that you kept this machine totally controlled by this company, was to even make all your own nuts and bolts. And
Nothing was interchangeable with another company's.
No.
Let me just stop this for a second and just check.